Sounds perfect.
Okay, thank you. And we're live. Assalamu alaikum, greetings everyone. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are in the world and watching us. My name is Ermin Sinanovic. I am the Executive Director of the Center for Islam in the Contemporary World at Shenandoah University in Virginia. And welcome to another CICW book talk. This is the last of our book talks before our summer break, and we're going to be back in the fall. And we are today graced by the presence of our guest and the author of the book we are discussing today, Dr. Hadia Mubarak. Dr. Hadia, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me on. It's a pleasure.
Absolutely. So I have already shared on the chat function the description of the book as well as Dr. Hadia's bio. So I'm not going to spend too much time except by saying that Dr. Hadia Mubarak is an assistant professor of religion at Queen's University in Charlotte in North Carolina. She has a PhD in Islamic Studies from Georgetown University. And the book that we are discussing is Rebellious Wives, Neglectful Husbands, Controversies in Modern Qur'anic Commentaries, published by the Oxford University Press. And it just came out 2 months ago, right?
Actually, it came out exactly May 9th, I believe. So 1 month.
May 9th. So it's a month ago. So it really is hot off press in many ways. So once again, welcome to Dr. Hadia and welcome to the audience. I know you are joining us from different places in the world, and we are grateful for your time. So the way that we usually conduct this is that I have a conversation with the author, I ask questions, and we engage in a conversation. But we have the chat function on our YouTube channel, which you can use even during the presentation. And if something comes up that arouses your curiosity, that you think is really interesting, please feel free to share your comments or questions or insights in that chat function, and we will take it and discuss it here. And if it's safe for you to do so, please identify yourselves. It helps us to know who we are talking to and to know where you're from, because in the past we've had audience from literally all over the world, and we like to know where you are joining us from. So I usually at this point show the book, but unfortunately this morning when I was leaving my home, I forgot it at home. So Dr. Hadia, if you don't mind, just show the book so people can see that we're talking about the real thing here.
Yeah, this is the book. And if anyone has questions as to where this title comes from, we will get into that today. I mean, it has to do with the dominant way in which nushuz and the shoes of men and women was understood. So this is where this title comes from, but I'm not actually providing any counseling, just FYI. Some people think they're going to figure out how to deal with their respective spouses. This is not what this book is about.
Got it.
Yeah.
Got it. So we're going to go into that in a moment. So I'll start with the question that I always start with, and that is, what motivated you to write this book, and how does it relate to your larger academic and or personal interests, and what is the main argument or thesis of this book?
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Dr. Sinanovic, for having me. And I want to thank the Center for Islam in the Contemporary World at Shenandoah University for hosting this book talk. In fact, one of the founders, Dr. Yunus Mirza, is an old colleague of mine. We did our master's and PhD together. So it's really a pleasure to be here. So my first training in Tafsīr studies began when I was doing my Master's of Arts in Contemporary Arab Studies at Georgetown University. And my mentor at the time was Dr. Barbara Stowasser, a well-known name in the field of Tafsīr studies. In fact, she was a pioneer in writing on women and gender issues in Tafsīr and really kind of comparing the medieval and modern periods. And I still remember sitting in one of my first classes on Tafsīr and reading through medieval commentaries on verse 434. And I was really just surprised by what I found. I was really taken aback as someone who grew up as a Muslim in the United States, as someone who was familiar, if you will, to some extent with the Muslim tradition, but not really. I was still doing my master's at the time, so I wasn't as familiar with the classical tradition or with the scholarly tradition. But I felt, as a Muslim at the time, reading some of the, to be quite honest, there were some patriarchal interpretations that I came across in these commentaries I was reading on verse 434. And I felt a dissonance between what I believed the Quranic ethos on gender to be, what I believed the Quranic paradigm on women and gender to be, and what I found in some of these commentaries. And so this led me on a long journey to kind of discover this genre of tafsir. What is this genre of tafsir? Where are these ideas and interpretations coming from? And the main gist of this book really was to try to understand, how does modernity impact the way modern commentators were interpreting some of these verses, like verse 434, like the verse on men have a degree over women? Do we, when we compare medieval and modern commentaries on the Quran, are we finding what some scholars have called a monolithically and consistently patriarchal repository of interpretations? Or do we find some differences? And so really, when I set out to write this book, that was a central question that I was examining. And I came away surprised with what I found. I'll just right now suffice to mention two main findings, right? And one thing I will say to kind of caveat what I'm about to say in terms of my findings is that when I was doing my graduate studies in the early 2000s, this was like 03 to 05, this was when I was first doing my training in my graduate studies. At the same time, there was a kind of a flourishing of academic scholarship in the field of women and gender in the Quran. And much of this scholarship, I would say, was sort of indicting tafsir as, sort of making sweeping generalizations about this genre as decidedly misogynistic, voiceless of women's perspectives, monolithically patriarchal. Yet what I found problematic is that some of this scholarship was not really engaging with tafsir, right? Or it was sort of, in my opinion or my assessment, it was engaging with tafsir in a sort of, really not really going in depth, right? It was just very sort of generalized, like, trying to look at 150 commentators, right? And commentators are human beings, and they reflect a complexity that every single one of us represents. We're complex human beings, and we have to kind of think about their intellectual environment, their political environment, their historical environment. What were some of the invisible factors that we can't see in their commentaries that were actually shaping their commentaries? And so two main things I'll mention in terms of what I came away with is that my findings capture a medieval and modern tafsir tradition with pluralistic, complex, and evolving interpretations of women and gender in the Quran. And this diversity undermines existing depictions of medieval interpretations as monolithically patriarchal, although, right, that's not to absolve the tradition of patriarchy. We certainly will find some very patriarchal ideas in the tradition, right? And so whether we're looking at medieval commentators or modern ones, my research demonstrates that commentators, exegetes, were clearly concerned with curbing potential abuse or injustice against women. And at the same time, they posit some interpretations which entrenched male privilege, granting, for example, men a level of authority over women. And it's not black and white. And really the gist of my book is I take a deep dive into their actual interpretations, right? And the way in which both medieval and modern exegetes, while elaborating sometimes on the ways in which men were preferred in some instances, as we can find, for example, in some interpretations of 434 or verse 228 in chapter 2 of the Quran, at the same time, they reined in or restricted men's privileges by articulating women's legal and ethical rights during the process of marriage and divorce. For example, the themes of removal of harm, of justice, of men's responsibility to provide kind companionship to their wives, husn al-mu'ashara, of speaking about women's financial rights, their sexual rights, among other issues, were very central to their understanding of marriage and divorce in the Quran. And so my argument is that these binary notions of this genre as either patriarchal or either egalitarian does not withstand a substantive engagement. And what we find is this pluralism and this complexity that I hope my book conveys. And the second, really briefly, key takeaway was just this notion that Quranic commentaries are a dialectic, and they're oftentimes a lot more being influenced or shaped to some extent by their intellectual and political, historical environments in ways that we might not be able to visibly see in the commentaries, and that requires the reader to go dig up what was going on and why was al-Zamakhshari saying what he said, or al-Razi or al-Baydawi, like what was going on in their context.
Okay, well, thank you. That sets the stage really nicely for the rest of our conversation. So the tradition of tafsir, or the interpretation of the Quran, is really one of my favorite traditions too, in as genre in Islamic studies. And I, just like you, I often found it kind of unfair the way that it was painted and pictured. And I think we have now in contemporary scholarship some of the attempts, including yours, to try to rescue the tafsir tradition from those depictions. So your study is based on the study of three modern contemporary tafsirs, or interpretations. So tell us briefly about why you chose these three, and who are the writers and the authors of these three tafsirs.
Yeah, thank you. So one thing that the book tries to do, especially for those of you who maybe are starting to read the book and getting through the first few chapters, is to try to situate these commentators within the broader ruptures and continuities happening in the modern Muslim world, right? Looking at the impact of colonialism, the impact of the creation of the modern nation state, the demise of traditional institutions of religious scholarship, the kind of marginalization of the ulama class. Of course, I talked about colonialism, but colonialism can also be unpacked in terms of what did that mean for society, but what did it mean not only militarily, politically, economically? What did it mean from a discursive perspective? What kind of discourses were generated by the colonial presence, which were then internalized by some of the natives, right? Some of the indigenous Arabs, Muslims in specifically North Africa. So all of the four commentators. So there's three commentaries. One of them is co-authored. I'll talk about them really quickly. So the first work I examine is Tafsīr al-Manār by both Muhammad Abdo and Rashid Rida. There's a lot that can be, Johanna Pink is a good source on Johanna Pink, and Johannes Jansen also have written about Tafsīr al-Manār, among other scholars. So Tafsīr al-Manār was considered one of the first modernist approaches to Quranic interpretation. And, the reason I select these three, and I'll introduce the other two in a moment, is because each of them represent a unique typology of modern Muslim thought, a unique orientation of a Muslim thought that continues to shape Muslim societies today. So the second commentator is Sayyid Qutb, who was known as an Islamist. He really starts out his career as a literary critic, as what a lot of people don't realize. And in fact, I argue in this book that the impact and influence of his book had much less to do with his political ideology than it had to do with the unique skills he brought forth as a literary critic. This idea of looking for al-jaw al-musiqi, right? The sort of musical rhythm or musical atmosphere of a chapter, right? It's not what we oftentimes would associate with someone like Qutb. So he was an Islamist, and Muhammad al-Tahrīr ibn Ashur is the third commentator I look at, who also represents a unique orientation in modern intellectual orientation in the modern history of the Arab world, which I argue is neo-traditionalism. And as a neo-traditionalist, he was very traditionally trained, but he also, obviously, for those of you who are interested in Muhammad al-Tahrīr ibn Ashur and are familiar with his works on Maqasid al-Sharia, was a reformer. But his agenda for intellectual reform very much differed than scholars like Muhammad Abdo or Rashid Rida. And in many ways, he was trying to salvage, if you will, the methods of the scholarly tradition, the classical methods. And he articulates a path for change by reviving the principles and methodologies that underlie the Islamic scholarly tradition. And so each of them, I think, are very interesting, each of the commentaries. And their orientations are important to take stock of because they actually impact the way they approach the Quran. So, the fact that, for example, Abdo is a modernist, or the fact that we can say Rashid Rida was sort of a reform Salafi, he kind of veers from modernism to Salafism towards the latter end of his life, the fact that Qutb was an Islamist or that Ibn Ashur is a neo-traditionalist, they actually, these orientations impact the way they approach the Quran and the way they interact with a scholarly tradition. And so they kind of provide this window into the way diverse intellectual orientations are responding to the challenge of articulating the Quran's position on women within the first half of the 20th century. And also, at the end of chapter 2 of my book, I talk about the different kind of modes of modernity that they encounter. And we need to remember and bear in mind that they are actually encountering the Arab world through a different mode of modernity, if you will. For Rashid Rida and for Muhammad Abdo, colonialism obviously was, really very much on their radar, but the creation of the nation state was still not there. This idea of, forging new national identities, whereas Qutb and Ibn Ashur, on the other hand, were dealing with a different political reality. They were dealing with the political reality of the modern nation state and how to articulate and retain a relevance for Islam within these new political and legal contexts. So that's what's really different. I try to, I try to kind of situate them within these contexts and try to understand how it impacts their own trajectory.
Yeah, thank you. And I was going to ask about the whole issue of colonialism and modernity. All three tafsirs are written in the shade, pun intended, of colonialism and modernity. But you already kind of talked and indicated that. So maybe it would be better if we just kind of delve into sort of the meat of the book, where's the beef? So now let's look into that, if you don't mind. And feel free, of course, to bring, and I'm sure you will, the whole issue of colonialism, modernity, and how it impacts all of these new interpretations, if you will. So I'll start by asking this. So a lot of ink has been spent on 434, and you indicated it. And I will just, for the sake of our audience, read the translation. And this is from Abdullah Yusuf Ali. Is the translation I had on the shelves, but I noticed that this is one that was also redacted by the Saudis. So I wish I had your book with me. Unfortunately, like I said, I left it at home because I would read your translation, which you might want to do. But so it says here, men are the protectors and maintainers of women because Allah has given the one more, and then between the parentheses, strength than the other, and because they support them from their means. Therefore, the righteous women are devoutly obedient and guard in the husband's absence what Allah would have them guard. As to those women on whose part you fear disloyalty and ill conduct, admonish them first, next refuse to share their beds, and last beat them, and then between the parentheses, lightly. But if they return to obedience, seek not against them means of annoyance, for Allah is most high, great, and above you all. And usually most of the people that write about these topics will start with this verse, but you actually turn the tables around and you start with 128, the verse 128 in chapter 4, which says, if a wife fears cruelty or desertion on her husband's part, there is no blame on them if they arrange an amicable settlement between themselves. And here is the Quran talks about nushuz of the husband, right? Which here is translated as cruelty, desertion. You call it neglectful, it's in the title of your book. So tell us a little bit about this. What is the nushuz of the husbands? Because I don't think many people even know that this is in the Quran or that it talks about it. And why did you choose to start your discussion on this topic with this particular verse instead of 434, which is the entry point for many people?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question, Dr. Sinanovich. I'm glad you brought that up, because I think, the fact that the disproportionate attention on the nushuz of women in contrast to nushuz of men, I think speaks something about our own realities, right? And when I talk about how these commentators were influenced by their own environments, we too, as scholars, are influenced by our own environments. Our intellectual priorities, if you will, what we choose to focus on, what questions we're asking, are very much a function of our positionality and where we are in the world. And some of these questions I raise are without question a function of my own state of double consciousness, if you will, as which I talk about in my introduction, as a Muslim American, as someone who, you know, it belongs to both parts of the world, of, you know, the Muslim world and the West, especially as a daughter of immigrants, right? Not being necessarily an indigenous American. And so, you know, just to get straight into these verses that you talked about. So a lot of people are unaware that the Quran uses the same word, nushuz, to describe a condition in which husbands are sometimes guilty of, and a condition of which wives are sometimes guilty of. I will say that, you know, the attention on the verse on women's nushuz obviously has to do with the latter part of the verse, which you just translated, right? And this really important question of, does the Quran actually allow men to physically discipline their wives, which clearly, you know, raises ethical issues. But I also argue in the book that it raised ethical issues for medieval exegetes. It wasn't that they just, you know, entertained a literal translation of that word or of that phrase. One thing I find is that although the Quran uses, so let me actually start by just mentioning that what I found interesting is the Quran, if we look at the literal text of the Quran, it never describes these women as nashes. It doesn't say a nashizat or a nawashes, you know, for the men. It says, if you fear nushuz, and it's sort of creating this distance between the subject and the act of nushuz, right? Meaning that there's sort of this maybe ambiguity as to, like, are they not? Maybe the husband thinks his wife is committing nushuz, and we'll talk about, well, what is nushuz, right? And there's a reason why I don't translate it, because, and you know, right away, because any translation actually requires an interpretation. And there's a spectrum of interpretation. So what are those interpretations? I find that medieval exegetes actually viewed men and women's nushuz in very gendered ways. So women's nushuz was sort of this rebellion, this defiance of men, of husbands. Some of them constrained it, right? I talk about like al-Tabari, this 10th century exegete. It wasn't like, oh, it just her disobedience, period. No, it was very much qualified as a disobedience or reneging on his legal rights, right? And that was often understood as men's sexual rights or husbands' sexual rights over their wives. And so a wife who consistently would refuse her husband in bed, let's say, to be just very blunt about it, you know, would be considered nashes, right? Interestingly, that's not the way they viewed the nushuz of men. It was sort of like this neglect or this disinterest, or just, he's no longer interested in her, right? And why is he no longer interested in this wife? Why is he, like, is there another woman that's caught his attention? So they actually entertain this notion, two things in defining men's nushuz. One, why is the wife no longer of interest to the husband? Maybe she's become old. Maybe she's no longer attractive. Maybe she's gained a lot of weight. You know, well, if you think about it, you know, when you're, having children and pregnancies and whatnot, probably a woman's body shape is going to change, right? And so they talk about these real issues, that why is he not interested in her? Perhaps she's undergone these changes. The second thing they allude to, it's indirect, is that perhaps there's this other woman in the picture that he's either interested in marrying, or he's already married to, and she's taking his interest over this other wife who he's being nashes, he's committing nushuz towards. And therefore, because of this understanding of men's nushuz, it very much influences the way they interpret the rest of the verse, of to like, what should this settlement look like? If this, for men's nushuz, the remedy is that the wife and husband should mutually seek a settlement. And it's very much a mutual, you know, the word in the Quran says yusliha, it's in dual form, that this is a mutual settlement. Ironically, a lot of medieval exegetes actually put the onus on the wife to settle. Whether we're looking at al-Tabari, al-Razi, al-Qurtubi, you know, there was this emphasis that since the husband is not interested in the wife should somehow like waive some of his legal responsibilities towards her, that maybe no longer exacting from him, you know, intimacy or haq al-mabit, they called it, the right, a woman, whether a husband was married to one wife or several wives, every wife had the right of haq al-mabit, this idea that he had to spend a certain number of nights with his wife. And oftentimes, since they understood this men's nushuz as sexual disinterest, for the most part, right? For the most part, that's how medieval exegetes were viewing this verse concerning men. They said, okay, she should then therefore settle and say, I waive my rights for you to have to spend a certain number of nights with me, and therefore this other wife. So again, there's this question: is there another woman in the picture? And oftentimes they assumed there was, so they said, okay, she would settle and say he can prefer this other woman over her. Atharaha. What's really interesting though is they said this was not allowed unless the first wife agreed to it, or the wife who is the subject or recipient of his nushuz. She had to consent. If she did not consent to waiving any of her legal rights, then that settlement was wrong, was ethically and legally wrong. So there's this complexity, but I do want to point out one modern mufassir, Ibn Ashur, who sort of overturns these interpretations in a really interesting way, because I mentioned earlier, he was very classically trained, and he was trying to revive the relevance of this classical tradition. And he says, no, the nushuz of men and women, first of all, is the same. It's hatred of the other. It's this, and if you think about it, hatred is non-gendered, right? Like the husband and wife could equally hate each other, right? Whereas, disobedience, on the other hand, was seen as, oh no, only women could be disobedient. Whereas husbands, that was not the, sort of understanding. It wasn't like, oh, husbands could also be disobedient. But really, if we think about it, if husbands are reneging on women's legal rights, it's really the same thing. So Ibn Ashur says nushuz is nushuz for men and for women, which I found really interesting. The second argument, well, specifically with men's nushuz, is he differed from most medieval commentators in saying this sulh here is not for her to waive her rights to stay in a dysfunctional marriage or to stay in a marriage in which her husband was not interested in her. It's actually her exit out of this marriage. It was this dignified exit. And he makes this argument through philological and legal methods. Philologically, he shows how wasulhu khair, where God says and settlement is better or reconciliation is better, wasn't referring to the first settlement, wasn't referring to wa yusliha sulha, that they should settle a settlement, that it was actually referring to something else. It was a different settlement, and it was this really dignified exit. He also had legal arguments. He was a Maliki scholar, and I think that legal training or that positionality also influences the way he approaches both the nushuz of the ayah of nushuz of men and nushuz of women, because harm could never be afflicted or reciprocated, and a woman had the grounds to leave a marriage, and a judge, if you will, or a jurist had the authority to annul a marriage based on the grounds of harm, that a husband was harming his wife. And he seems to be very attuned to this, and he recognizes that the nushuz of men maybe means that she's being harmed and she actually needs an exit out of this situation. And that's how he interprets this second sulh we find in this verse.
Yeah, thank you. That's such an interesting discussion. And of course, for those who end up reading the book, and I hope that all of you will, you'll find even deeper and greater discussion. But let us move on from 128 to 434. Obviously, it's unavoidable. And what I found interesting, that at the beginning of the chapter where you discuss it, you provide a translation, and it is your own translation. And like I said, I unfortunately left the book at home, but in the part of the verse that talks about if you fear the nushuz of the wife, and then, the verse says, فَعِظُوهُنَّ وَاهْجُرُوهُنَّ فِي الْمَضَاجِعِ وَاضْرِبُوهُنَّ. And the first one is, give them an advice, then separate from them in bed. And وَاضْرِبُوهُنَّ you leave untranslated. Tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, so I'll be honest, like I struggled, and I struggled with this
Everybody
verse.
does.
Yeah, I struggled with this verse many years ago when I was writing my, when I was doing my MA, my master's degree, and then later my doctoral studies. And when I was, my first academic essay on this, some of you may be familiar with, is called Breaking the Interpretive Monopoly, where I really focus on medieval commentaries of this verse. And then I kind of contrast that to the prophetic example and the prophetic hadith, and I kind of entertain this idea that semantically could وَضْرِبُوهُنَّ have meant something other than physical discipline. And of course, we all are familiar with certain contemporary scholars who've made this argument, right? One of whom is Abdul Hamid Abu Sulaiman. God have mercy on his soul. He recently passed away, who wrote a really interesting linguistic analysis of this verb and the way its conjugates appear in the Qur'an. This idea of darab, that perhaps if we look at the prophetic example, we look linguistically at it, it could mean something else, right? So we're familiar with, and by the way, the English translation by Ladih Bakhtiyar adopts that position. So Ladih Bakhtiyar is one of the few contemporary translations that actually does not translate it as strike. I believe she translates it as separate. Another contemporary translator of the Quran, Ahmad Adi, also has a different semantic understanding of that, or understanding of its semantics, and he says it's actually it's actually to have intercourse with, just to be very, that's what he says in his, or how he translates this word, and he gets this from Lisan al-Arab, I believe, that ضرب الفحل الناقة, something to this extent, that it could mean, which requires some hermeneutical kind of I guess a jump, if you will, because
acrobatics,
because the second step is to avoid them in bed, and so then the third step would be a reversal of this. But I don't really touch upon this in my chapter. Instead, I really am interested in how did medieval commentators understand this verse, and then how did modern commentators understand this verse, and what are the changes that we find if we compare, again, the modern genre with the medieval one. And there were a couple of things that stood out to me. One is that I found, to my surprise, that medieval commentators, in contrast to the way they've been depicted by many scholars, did not literally translate this verse, right? Because a literal translation or a literal interpretation of this verse would say these steps don't have to be in order, right? Like you just jump, you do all three simultaneously, so there's 3 disciplinary steps that Dr. Sinanovich just mentioned, right? If a woman is guilty of nushuz, or a husband fears that his wife is guilty of nushuz, which was translated as defiance, rebellion, disobedience, refusal to abide by her sexual responsibilities, if you will, or a more contemporary interpretation was it was some sort of sexual indiscretion, that she was maybe actually sleeping around or cheating on him. Sayyid Qutb actually sees nushuz as some sort of psychological perversion, he says. He says this is not like a normal person. It's not a normal situation. It's not just, some disobedience. It's something far beyond that. If a person is not responding to advice, and a person is not responding to, al-hajr, which is to just avoid her completely, then there's something really, really psychologically perverse with this person, he says. Well, a third commentator, Ibn Ashur, actually also sees nushuz as something very serious, that it would require the couple to actually take this case to a judge. That this is not something that couples should try to resolve in the privacy of their own homes. And one reason he says this is because he recognizes the potential for abuse that could happen. And he also argues that if a husband is allowed to hit his wife while he's angry with her, then it's very likely that he's going to vent his anger on her and he will abuse her. And that any judges who find that a husband have found that a husband has done this to his wife should rebuke him and even imprison him if needed, right? To set an example that you cannot abuse your wife. So, but what about the medieval commentators? Did they also, did it sit well with them for a husband to just hit his wife? I would say no. I mean, based on my reading, no, they did not. It did not just sit well with them, and they try to impose a few restrictions, procedural restrictions, if you will, on their understanding of this verse. Many of you are probably familiar with those procedural restrictions. One of which is, this وَاللَّاتِي تَخَافُونَ نُشُوزَهُنَّ. If you fear their nushuz, does that mean like you're just suspecting, or they actually committed it? And they say, no, it's not just you think they did, that they actually committed nushuz. Second of all, they would say, Okay, you can't jump from step 1 to jump to step 2 to step 3 unless you've given each step a certain amount of time, you've actually really tried to advise her sincerely, etc., etc. So they impose this procedural or chronological restriction. And then third, when it came to how they interpreted, this is the dominant medieval interpretation, right? When it came to how they interpreted وَضْرِبُوهُنَّ, they argued that this cannot inflict harm because the prophetic hadith or tradition is very clear. لا ضرر ولا ضرار. There can be no harm, there can be no infliction of harm, nor can harm be reciprocated. So accordingly, there's no way a husband can then be allowed to then inflict violence upon his wife. So they said this is really just a symbolic hitting, right? And that's the traditional kind of dominant interpretation we find. It wasn't like you actually are allowed to hit your wife the way we would think of in our modern period. It was like this symbolic hitting of with a handkerchief or a miswak, which is the sort of this little kind of not really a toothpick, but it was like a toothbrush, if you will. It was really symbolic, and they emphasized throughout the medieval tradition, you find it very clearly غير مبرح, right? That it cannot, it's non-injurious. It can't injure the wife. Okay, so is that all we find in the medieval commentaries? No, actually, from the beginning, very beginning, during the period of the tabi'in, the successors to the companions, we had outliers to this dominant position. We had someone like Ata ibn Abi Rabah, who was considered the mufti of Mecca in the 8th century, who says, no, a husband should not ever hit his wife. He can get angry with her, but he should not hit her. And that this seeming imperative here is actually a karahiyah al-darb, meaning that this act of hitting is disliked. And that's why, in fact, if we think of its historical context, it was actually restricting an existing license or an existing practice, right? And we know that this practice existed then and exists now, unfortunately. Misogyny has not changed. Patriarchy has not changed. Violence, whether it's abuse against wives or abuse against children, this unfortunately has stayed with us until the modern periods. And so at that time, we have reports that indicate that there was domestic violence. And in that, if we consider this verse within that historical context, we find that it was restricting this, right? And saying the only time you can ever resort to a sort of symbolic hitting is under these conditions. But that's, again, the dominant interpretation. But you have outliers like Ibn Abi Rabah, who said, no, you don't even with the miswak, even with the whatever, a handkerchief or a piece of tissue like this, right? You had in the Abu Bakr ibn al-Arabi in the early 12th century also take this position based on Ata ibn Abi Rabah's statement, who says, basically, very clearly, he says, listen, a man cannot try to discipline his wife or children without losing his own religion or something of his own religion, recognizing that this is spiritually inferior to restraining your anger, because we know the Prophet said, peace be upon him, restrain your anger. And then you have Fakhruddin al-Razi, for example, in the early 13th century, saying that the preference is to never hit based on a Shafi'i's position. And where did the Shafi'i's position come from? It came from a prophetic hadith that says, وَلَنْ يَضْرِبَ خِيَارُكُمْ, the best of you would never hit your wife, right? Among many other prophetic traditions. And then I move on to the 20th century and show how Ibn Ashur is sort of reviving Ata ibn Abi Rabah's argument. So you have a 20th century Tunisian mufti who brings back Ata ibn Abi Rabah's argument and says, listen, really correct understanding of this verse is that this is not in any way justifying abuse or the hitting of wives. And the only way they could arrive at that interpretation is if we understand something about the methods of tafsir, that it's not the way we often find modern Muslims engaging with the Qur'an. That's very sort of just literal. They engage with the Qur'an through these really complex methods and tools of looking at of language, of poetry, pre-Islamic poetry, of looking at historical context, of reports at that time, looking at law, looking at theology. So it's very complex, which allowed them to therefore arrive at complex interpretations. And I'm sorry for this long-winded answer, but this is a topic.
It was so fascinating. I was so engrossed and I was so immersed in your explanation. I I even forgot to turn on my screen here.
I was
But
going
yeah,
to say this is something I feel passionate about. If you
absolutely.
can
No,
tell,
it is,
right?
it is, it is,
Because
it is.
I do think, as a Muslim, that we have an onus, we have a responsibility to speak out against domestic violence, which we have
Absolutely.
organizations that work on this, Peaceful Families Project, and we have
Yeah.
throughout Muslim history, we've had the activists and the advocates, but I also think that we need the scholarship to correct the myths, if you will, for both Muslims and people of all faiths, in different faiths.
Absolutely, domestic violence is a huge problem all over the world, in all communities, in all religions, in all ideologies, whatever you want to call it. You'll find domestic abuse, unfortunately, everywhere in the world. And for those of you who are watching us on our channel, you will find one of our previous discussion was with Julianne Hammer, Imam Muhammad Majid, and Selma Abu Jadiri, where we talked about this domestic violence issue, Peaceful Families Project, for instance. I think it's almost a 2-hour conversation that we had, because it was a panel, so we had several guests. So for those of you who are more interested in expanding on this, you can go back to one after this, of course. Please watch us to the end. But after we're done, you can watch that one of our older videos on these particular issues. We are really committed to that here at the CICW. Another verse that you discuss in the book is in the Surah al-Baqarah 228, right? When the Quran describes a divorce, how it should happen if it comes to that. And then it talks about the rights and duties. First, about reconciliation and so on. And then it says, and women shall have rights similar to the rights against men, according to what is equitable. But men have a degree over them, right? That's what the Quran says. So tell us about what is meant by this. What is the meaning of this? How do, especially the 3 tafsir, modern tafsirs that you studied, how do they understand this notion of daraja, of this degree of men over women?
Yeah, thank you. So, first of all, I do want to point out that when we look at the medieval tradition, again, because this is where I start out with every chapter, I look at the medieval mufassirin, the medieval commentators, and then kind of contrast that or compare it to the modern ones. So I do want to note that early on we have al-Tabari, who basically argues that this daraja here is basically a daraja of responsibility that, he quotes none other than the cousin of the Prophet, peace be upon him. This cousin's name was Abdullah ibn Abbas, who's considered one of the greatest authorities, early authorities of the Qur'an. And he basically argues that this daraja is darajat at-tanazul, that the husband should waive some of the wife's responsibilities towards him, while he should continue to still fulfill all of his responsibilities towards her, right? And we can say, well, where did he get this idea from, right? Where did sorry, one second, I'm just going to pull this up. Where did Ibn Abbas understand this? And this is, by the way, the opinion that al-Tabari also takes, right? He says that, and I guess to backtrack just a little bit, is you have this really important clause right before it, which says women have rights like the rights upon them. So, and this is very much a legal verse. And this is something that we often forget, that this is a verse that's talking about what happens to a wife after a husband pronounces divorce, right? And that there are certain legal responsibilities that each have to abide by. So you have scholars like al-Tabari, like al-Qurtubi, and I believe al-Razi early on, who understood this clause that women have rights like the rights upon them within this legal context of the waiting period, right? What were some of these legal rights and legal responsibilities? Well, the verse itself clarifies, and it says, that the wife should not conceal what's in her room. So for these 3 cycles, while she's waiting for this waiting period to expire. And why is this waiting period important, right? So really, this is a legal verse that's prescribing a waiting period for the husband and wife while they're awaiting. So the divorce is not final until this waiting period expires, even after the husband pronounces divorce, right? Which if we think about it actually within that historical context, it's really restricting divorce. In many ways, the Quran is applying many restrictions on this process of divorce. That divorce is not something to be taken lightly, and that, there's also a limit, right, to how many times a husband can pronounce a divorce. Like if he divorces his wife more than 2 times, well, the third time is it's over, it's irrevocable. And it's irrevocable for other reasons. Like if he, for example, swears that he would not sleep with his wife and then he does it for over 4 months, for some scholars, they said that was an irrevocable divorce. Like there's no going back on this. There are legal consequences to the things that come out of your mouth. That is basically what I find is being established in many of the verses and the commentaries on these verses. And so I think that context to this verse is really important, that we have to recognize that this is a verse that's prescribing certain obligations that become obligatory or become necessary at the moment when the husband pronounces divorce, which is this waiting period. The wife should not conceal whether she's menstruating or whether she's pregnant during this time. And then the husband, it says very clearly, should not revoke the divorce unless he intends to reconcile with her. And the exegetes took this very seriously, and they said, if he tries to take her back, and he actually is only taking her back to harm her, if a judge can ascertain this, he should annul the marriage. Like you cannot exercise as a husband this right to revoke a divorce unless you really intend to live with her in kindness, right? As the Quran says, وَعَاشِرُهُنَّ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ, verse 419, right? That you if you cannot abide by this, then you don't have the right to revoke it. But what if the husband doesn't intend well, but the judge cannot ascertain this? And they talked about this idea that intention is only known to God. And if the judge cannot find proof or evidence that he's revoking this divorce to harm her, that he's legally allowed to revoke the divorce, but he is still sinful in the eyes of God. And so there was this clear separation between ethics and law, if you will, which is, I think, so important for us to recognize this recognition that the law and ethics were these two different disciplines, and something could be legally sound and not be ethically sound and not be moral. And this is also important when it comes to the polygyny verse, which I'll talk about in a second. But I do want to mention that in this, when it comes to the contemporary mufassirin, what was really interesting is that it was Sayyid Qutb in this case who took a more, I guess you can say, egalitarian interpretation of this verse, especially the idea of men's degree. And he said, you know what this degree is? This is the degree of his ability, his legal right to revoke the divorce during this waiting period. And he says, period, that's it. It should not be taken out of its context. This is a very specific legal context. The verse starts out, and divorced women shall wait concerning themselves for 3 monthly cycles. And the rest of the verse clearly outlines what the legal rights and responsibilities of each party are during this waiting period. And then it ends with saying, and men have a degree over them. So what's that degree? He says, well, if we think about it, the man has the upper hand during this waiting period. Since he pronounced a divorce, only he can revoke the divorce. The wife, on the other hand, is waiting either for this waiting period to expire, which if she dislikes her husband, she's probably eager for it to expire so she can move on with her life. Or if she didn't want the divorce, right? If she wants to stay within this marriage, she's waiting for it to expire or in hopes, maybe she's waiting actually for, she's hopeful that he will revoke the divorce. So really she's in this vulnerable situation in this legal context where she's sort of waiting. She's waiting, and he's the one who, you can say, the ball is in his court. He can revoke the divorce or just let it expire, and then that divorce is official. And so Sayyid Qutb says this is absolutely what this degree means here, and it's not this, an unqualified degree or privilege that men have. My point in looking at all of this, right, is that we find a spectrum of interpretation. We find some really patriarchal interpretations that this is, men's superior intellect, men's, superior physical constitution, that this is, men are the, warriors, and men are the imams and leaders, and they're the writers and the intellectuals, and, and they have beards and women don't have beards, which are really subjective interpretations. And one thing I point out in the book, which is an argument that Karen Bauer also makes, is that when around the 6th Islamic century, 12th Gregorian century, when exegetes begin to say, look at, well, why? Like, why do men have a degree? Why are men qawamun? And they try to answer this question of why, rather than just interpreting the verse. This is where we get a lot of subjective reasoning or subjective analysis that really cannot be substantiated by any clear method within a tafsir, right? Like when you're saying, oh, well, men have a degree because they're just better human beings. There's no evidence for this, right? It's a very subjective analysis. And they might not say they're better human beings, but you do have one medieval mufassir, Ibn Kathir, who makes the argument that this is, the preference of men in this world and in the next world, right? And so clearly, as someone who's familiar with the Quran, you read this interpretation and you say, this is clearly violating or defying or contradicting explicit verses in the Quran, right? That says that human beings are all equal in the eyes of God, and that they will be compensated, whether male or female, like verse 3:195, that they will be compensated equally according to their own works, whether male or whether female. We have countless verses in the Quran, 1672, right? Countless verses, literally, that says there shall be no injustice, and that gender does not matter, right? It's your moral consciousness, it's your deeds, it's your belief. These are the criteria that matter. And so when you find exegetes that clearly contradict this, you just know that this is a subjective analysis. And it's often very clear when you're reading these commentaries, because they're not attributing this to any piece of evidence.
Yeah, thank you so much. Well, I want to give a nod to our audience. They've been patiently waiting, and I do still have one question, because there is an important chapter of your book that we haven't discussed yet, but I do want to give them time. So please, for our audience, ask your questions, submit your comments in the chat function on YouTube. We do have one question. So the question is, what are your thoughts on Foucault's assessment of sex and gender as modern categories? Does that not make them inapplicable to apply to the medieval Muslim world?
I'm muted here. Can you say the last part of the question, please?
So the Foucault's assessment of sex and gender as modern categories, and does that not make them inapplicable to apply to the medieval Muslim world?
Well, I mean, I'm not necessarily applying his definition, but I do think the Quran does, if you will, distinguish between sex and gender, which is an important distinction to make, because gender and our notions of gender are oftentimes shaped by our context. Like, what does it mean to be masculine? What does it mean to be feminine, right? And our notions of gender, if you will, whereas, biological sex is very clear. Verse 4:1 says, we have created you as male and female, right? I believe, is it verse 4:1, right? Or is it, there's another verse 49:13, right? That says we have created you. Yes, but actually 4:1 and 49:13 both say this, that we have created you into male and female, right? And it's not saying we've created you, so I mean, I'm not trying to, I think just in terms of, I'm not sure if what the questioner is alluding to. I would say that the Quran does apply a sort of, my reading of the Quran, a binary understanding of gender as male or female. But I do, what I'm trying to distinguish between is what does biological sex mean in the Quran versus how our notions of gender, right, and what that means sort of constructed through discourses, through historical discourses or contemporary ones.
Thank you. Thanks. So we're going to return now to the book. There is one more chapter that I think we haven't discussed, and of course it's an important issue, and that is polygyny, or sometimes referred to as polygamy. The Quran says in chapter 4, verse 3, Surah An-Nisa, and if you fear that you shall not be able to deal justly with the orphans, marry women of your choice, 2 or 3 or 4, but if you fear that you shall not be able to deal justly with them, then only one, and so on. And this is often being used as a license for polygyny, where a Muslim man could marry up to 4 women, but a Muslim woman could only have 1 husband, right? So can you tell us a little bit about the interpretations of both classical and modern, and if there is difference between the two, especially in relation to the 3 tafsirs that you have studied for this book?
Find my unmute button here. There's a pretty large gap between the way medieval commentators approach this verse and modern ones, especially this verse in particular, right? And a lot of this has to do with the discourses, the accompanying discourses of modernity, in which Islam was sort of seen as a stumbling block. Like you have colonialists like, Evelyn Baring, known as Lord Cromer, who was the British consul in early 20th century Egypt, right? Who says Islam is sort of an obstacle to women's rights and women's progress. You had also the French in Algeria, right, and in Tunisia, see Islam as sort of this masculine, seditious religion that didn't provide, women the same rights that they believed Christianity, for example, provided, right? And Lord Cromer actually, he sort of conflates religion and culture and civilization, and even color, even skin color. If you read his book, right, he sometimes will say the dark-skinned Arab versus the fair-skinned European, right? It's quite interesting how he conflates these 3 things, 3 markers of identity. Nonetheless, because of the colonial critique on polygyny, which then also was repeated by indigenous Muslims, we find this defensiveness, especially with Rashid Rida, and to some extent with Sayyid Qutb, and each of them, however, is responding to a different critique. Rashid Rida is very much responding to the colonial critique and Western criticism on this verse, and he attaches to his tafsir this 8-page fatwa in which he's sort of responding to a medical student actually in the United States who tells him, how do I respond to Americans asking me about polygyny or polygamy? And then he it's very defensive in nature, which is interesting because his own mentor, Muhammad Abdo, actually argued for the repeal of polygyny. And he argued for the repeal of polygyny not because he said this is an ancient institution, it's out of sync with modernity, as some might assume. He actually used the Islamic legal maxim of preventing harm and accruing benefit, or maslaha, protecting the welfare of a community. And accordingly, he said that in today's age, this practice is actually inflicting harm upon families in a way that was not true during the prophetic era. And therefore, he appeals to his contemporary Hanafi scholars to say, we need to reform the laws on polygyny. So in many ways, even though Rida is his disciple, Rida's tafsir seems to overturn this position by just being very defensive and sort of trying to defend polygyny. Nonetheless, what I find interesting with both, Rida, Abdo, and then even Qutb, and I'll talk about Qutb's critique, is that they will acknowledge that Muslim men have abused this practice, right? And so it's not just a sort of defensiveness, but it's also recognizing that the reform needs to happen from within the community, and that Muslims have sort of used this as a license to, for sexual pleasure in a way that was not the intent of this verse. Qutb is responding to secular critiques or secular critics of this verse, and he, which is very much kind of consistent with his methodology. He talks about the divine manhaj, al-manhaj al-ilahi, the divine, the divine program, if you will, for human beings, and this kind of appealing to the knowledge of God as knowing humans better than we know ourselves, and therefore this practice of polygyny should be above critique. Yet he also will admit, and he has some very strong words to say about Muslims who abuse this practice. Ibn Ashur is not really as polemical. His tafsir is not as polemical as Tafsīr al-Manār and fi Zilāl al-Qur'an, and he sort of has a very classical a way of engaging this verse, which I found really interesting if we contrast that with the fact that he stood next to the modern Tunisian president Habib Bourguiba when he, in 1965, abolished polygyny in Tunisia, right? And he stood by him. We can say he sort of maybe endorsed the law, at least symbolically. And yet, in his tafsir of this verse, he does not make any sort of argument that we need to abolish this practice. It's a very classical approach. And I talk about the reasons why, right? We have to sort of understand this enigma and try to reconcile between his political stances and his intellectual ones. And a lot of this can be understood if we, through understanding Ibn Ashur as a person and his trajectory for reform and how he sort of represents almost this pessimism in what reform meant. He was a very enthusiastic reformer at the beginning of his intellectual career, and he seems to sort of distance himself from that and from sort of the public towards the end of his life and retreat towards the pen. And I think it was just this disenchantment with the direction reform took in Tunisia in specific, where it became really, really not just secular, but really anti-religious in many ways.
Yeah, that's such a great point. So I think we're coming close to an end of our conversation. We need to be mindful of time. I would, at the beginning, you did mention about two main takeaways of the book. So I'm going to skip that because you already talked about it. But I will ask you, what do you see as the main contribution or contributions of this book?
Yeah. Well, I think, I did mention the takeaway of just understanding Quranic commentaries as a dialectic, as a sort of engagement that the scholar is having with his intellectual, contemporaneous community, if you will, and that oftentimes there are invisible factors that we cannot see when we're just reading the commentary itself that we need to sort of try to understand. We need to try to situate these commentators within their own historical intellectual context, and also in order to be fair, right? In order to be fair and read them, I would say, with charity or with justice, is to try to understand what were some of the issues that really preoccupied them and to whom were they responding. The other takeaway is, there's been this sort of debate in contemporary scholarship on the Qur'an and its position on women. Scholars have argued, is the Qur'an patriarchal? Is it egalitarian? Is it, and you have a spectrum of interpretations. I talk about this in my introduction, with, for example, Kisha Ali and Aisha Hidayatullah taking the position that, and Ibrahim Musa as well, that there, maybe androcentrism is inherent to the text itself. That is, it is an androcentric text, in some ways privileging men or making the male experience the normative one, right? There is this argument. And then you have arguments of scholars like Amina Wadud and Esma Barlas and others, Aziz al-Hibri, Maysam al-Faruqi, who've argued that the Quran is egalitarian and that any misogyny or patriarchy we find is sort of a reading that's being imposed upon the Quran. And I think my book is intervening in this debate by just illustrating that the way Muslim exegetes understood the Quran was that it was divine discourse. And the divine ontology of the Quran, the divine origin of the Quran, opened the possibilities of meaning rather than restricted the possibilities of meaning. And to them, it was not possible for an exegete to say, this is absolutely the definitive meaning of this verse without any question. They understood their works as sort of contributing drops of water to an ocean, because they recognized that this was just a human effort to try to discern divine intent, which one can never definitively know. And because of this, the genre or project of Quranic interpretation was seen as a valid one, right? There was no closing, if you will, of the doors of tafsir at any point in Muslim history, right? It would be deemed heretical to try to close the gates of tafsir. And until today, it is seen as absolutely valid and a characteristic of the Muslim tradition to continue to opine meanings, to continue to contribute insights as to the meaning of the Quran, because it was seen as this endless horizon, if you will, upon which we try to just discern and understand what these verses actually mean. But there was no commentator I ever came across who felt that this was absolutely the definitive meaning. And there was just this humility of, God knows best, right? And this was the best human effort based on the tools that she or he had. And I think this is hopefully going to intervene in the way we understand not only tafsir, but understand the Quran itself.
Thank you so much. And that's a wonderful way to wrap up and end this discussion. So I would like to thank our audience for sticking with us for more than an hour and for contributing to our conversation. And of course, especially to Dr. Hadia Mubarak for taking her time to talk to us about her book. We're going to conclude it here. Please subscribe to our newsletter, visit our website at www.contemporaryislam.org, or subscribe to this YouTube channel. Follow us on social media for updates on our work, all the exciting activities that we do, and of course for our future conversations, seminars, and book talks. So once again, thank you all, and thanks Dr. Hadia Mubarak for this wonderful presentation.
Thank you so